Hello naturalist, Austin here. Hope you're doing well. Today I'm at Savage Bay Heritage Preserve. This is one of many heritage preserves that are managed by your South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and this is one of my favorites. It's in the outskirts of my home county, Kershaw County, and it was preserved thanks in part to Henry Savage, one of our earlier leaders in forestry and conservation in our state. We'll start by making some observations just of the habitats that we're in as we make our way to the bay, then as the habitats we go through along the margins of the bay, and then hopefully in the interior we'll also see some different species. So what the heck is a Carolina bay? Well, that's the mystery we hope to unpack today as we make our way to the bay. Currently, I'm just standing in high, dry sandhills ecosystem. We have longleaf pines here. We have a number of scrub oak species that are living behind me, all of which are well adapted to life in the high, dry, sandy hills that stretch through the center of our state, from Marlboro County, for example, Chesterfield County, all the way down to Aiken. If you take Highway 1 through our state, you pretty much ride along the sandhills ecoregion. And this is a place where you can find Carolina bays as well as to the southeast of this line. So, without further ado, why don't we make our way down to the Carolina Bay. And I'm just walking along the trail here, and the sides are just blanketed with a little fern species. This fern is known as bracken fern. Bracken fern is found often up on high, dry sand hills. Now that's a little strange for a fern, you know. Ferns make they still produce sperm that have to swim to the eggs, and that takes a little moisture and water for that to happen well, unless you can do really good at reproducing vegetatively. And so underneath the ground here is this huge matrix of little fern roots that are probably connecting a lot of these ferns together. In fact, some of these can live many, many years and climb well away from water simply because they are good at reproducing, so to speak, underneath the ground, and in essence often cloning themselves. Bracken fern. Here's a nice species in bloom. This is sparkleberry. You may have heard of this, especially if you live in the Richland Northeast area. Places such as that, many roads and streets and areas named after this plant. It's actually a blueberry. Grows like a shrub and has flowers just like our blueberries. Has fruits that are not quite as delectable, but nonetheless will be savory for many of the species that live out here in the forest. And so it's nice to see this guy in full bloom here. We'll have fruits coming on later in the summer. Sparkleberry. So I'm just retracing my steps here, the path upon which I've walked, and looking out through the bracken fern and the scrub oaks in the high, dry sand hills. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, there is a drop-off where the elevation changes and seems to sink a bit. And it appears from a distance, anyway, that the vegetation changes as well. So what could that be? That's our mystery for today. Well, let's move closer toward it and see what we can discover. Getting closer to the Carolina Bay now, and things have changed just a wee bit. If you notice, the vegetation is deep and green and lush and thick, and it is evergreen. These species are unlike the scrub oaks from the uplands that lose their leaves in the winter. These, you'll find, often have their leaves all year round, and boy, their spacing is dense. So there in bloom is a close cousin to probably one of the trees in your yard. That is a sweet bay magnolia there, one of the best smells in the forest this time of year. Flowers are closed up at this point, but that's probably when the pollinators in there. Beetles are the pollinators for this species, and they can crack open those closed petals and do all the proper fertilization that's required before the flower even opens. But sweet bay magnolia. So here we are at the margins of a Carolina bay, and as we look at the trail that leads out into it, we see that oh my, it's wet. In fact, it's full of agua. So what this means is that I'm going to have to back up and don my hip waders. So to just try to give you a feel for this vegetation that I'm trying to make my way through, it is dense. And that is quite characteristic, especially of the margins of many of these Carolina bays. But there is beauty within this crazy dense network of plants. Look at this beautiful flower spike here. That is Virginia willow. You may know it in the nursery trade as Virginia sweet spire. This has been cultivated and used in a lot of our lawns and gardens. It is prolific out here, and it has the air just smelling pretty fantastic. Got a few other big trees, it looks like, and maybe even an opening to all this just in the distance. So here we are out in the midst of the Carolina Bay, and I see big trees with big bases on them and dragonflies, and it appears that my left boot has a big leak in it, but it feels nice and I'm cool with that. And we are going to take a look at some of these species. So this one here with the big base, the big buttress as sometimes people will call it, this is pond cypress. So you may have heard of bald cypress whenever you visited places such as Congaree, but when we get a wetland, a body of water that tends to be isolated especially, and there's no river or stream flowing in and out of it, you often get this species, which is pond cypress. And when you visit the trunks of pond cypress, they tend to be a little bit smaller, a little bit narrower, maybe not quite so tall, but still a bit of a cathedral effect nonetheless. The leaves of pond cypress are different from that of bald cypress. Bald cypress has leaves that kind of fan out, almost like a feather. But on the other hand, pond cypress tends to have leaves where the needles, so to speak, stay very close to the midrib. They're all kind of standing up and pressed together. So I'm out in the middle of this Carolina Bay now, and I think you've probably noticed a couple of changes. One is that we are surrounded by water. So water fills up the Carolina Bays from rain. It doesn't come from tributaries such as rivers and streams. This is important because it means that the water also disappears in the late summer and the fall, leaving this a dry and maybe moist ecosystem, but it doesn't have standing water. Species care about that because they can come here and reproduce right now in the absence of fish. Fish tend to need a perennial, a year-round water source, but they don't have that here. And so other species can move in, such as dragonflies and damselflies and many amphibian species. They can reproduce in quick order, and their adults can move out of here by the time this wetland dries out in midsummer. Another obvious difference in this part of this ecosystem is that the vegetation is opened up. We have wider spacing between the plants compared to the ecosystem that I just walked through in order to get here. That has a lot to do with the different types of hydrologies that roots can handle. Some roots can handle being inundated by water for many, many months. Others don't do so well with that. And so out here we have species such as pond cypress that are okay having their roots encumbered by water for many, many months. And when you come here in late summer or in the fall, you'll see an abundance of grasses underneath here. It's a beautiful, picturesque, verdant grassland, with the exception of the pond cypress trees that tower above. So now I want to take the time to try to unpack some of the creatures that are living beneath the water. I have an abundance of dragonflies skirting by me, and it has me a bit excited about seeing what is underneath, because they are reproducing, they're mating, they're laying eggs, and we ought to find some creatures here below the water surface that'll give us a better appreciation of how important this wetland is to so many species. So I've just taken one single swipe with my dip net there, and look at the abundance of fauna that we found. There in the top of your screen is actually a larval damselfly. So you've heard of dragonflies and damselflies. Well, that's a damselfly baby. 3 little appendages coming out the rear end there. Those are gills, believe it or not. They can use those for paddling. Oop, just got a little nip by a predaceous diving beetle. The beetles are in and out of here. Now the beetles can come and go. They have wings. They don't worry about gills. If the wetland dries out, they can just fly to a new place. Damselfly is hoping this water hangs around long enough, and I think it will, for it to become an adult. Just below and to the right there is a tadpole, already with legs there. So probably one of our early breeding species, maybe a leopard frog or one similar that is going to be metamorphosed not too long from now. The toads also, the southern toads, breed early, and so they both will make use of this wetland. You come out here at night anytime in the spring and summer, and there is a huge cacophony of sounds. Look down here. Right there is a little side swimmer, so called because he swims on his side and he's approaching another friend of his, little aquatic saddlebug. Many different crustaceans that are living in here thanks to temporary wetland situations. Got a little salamander species hanging out here. This is a larval salamander. You can see his gills on the side. And this is probably a member of the mole salamander family, maybe a spotted salamander, your South Carolina state amphibian. So adults of this salamander live in the uplands, usually underneath the ground, but they move into this wetland as early as January when it rains in the evening, and they can reproduce, produce offspring. The offspring will be fully metamorphosed, hopefully, by the time this wetland dries out in early to midsummer. So there's the water boatman there. Legs adapted for swimming there. You see the little paddles, and he's hanging out in the sun for now, but when he gets going, it doesn't take him long. Let me give him a little push. Hey, little fella. Woo! We have a back swimmer here. One of the little bugs that likes to swim on his back. Got his boat paddle legs again, but he likes to be upside down. Has a big, strong beak. He'll approach his prey, stick the beak inside the body, ingest a little bit of digestive enzymes, and then pretty much liquefy the internal contents of the prey and suck it all back out and into his body. Back swimmer. Love this species. So we've been patient, and it's paid off, I think, because we've just caught a creature that I think is just fantastic for our lesson today. Let me see if I can work this animal out of here, out of my net without harming it. Atta girl. She is rather wound up. This is a difficult species to capture because they're such erratic and fast in their flight, but I've been in training as a naturalist for quite some time. And so I have developed my skills to some degree, aside from the 10 dragonflies that I already missed. Anyway, looky here. This is, ladies and gentlemen, a Carolina saddlebags. Tramea Carolina, named after our Carolina colony, you know, and we're in a Carolina bay, so this is rather fitting. I'm looking at what appears to be a male, and so the males are going to have, you know, boy parts on the base of their abdomen. They actually take the sperm and they move it from the tip of their abdomen to the base of their abdomen before they breed and hitch up with the female, and that's why you see them actually hooked together. He attaches his the end of his abdomen, these little appendages here, to the back of her head. She can then reach around and touch her abdomen to the boy parts, and everything can go down as planned. And these are really amazing species. They have a little tiny dark spot here, kind of reddish in color, especially in the sunlight, appearing to someone sort of like saddlebags on the side of a horse, and that's why we get the name saddlebags. So we're just looking at this creature up close, the Carolina saddlebags, and there you see the appendages at the end of the abdomen there. Again, he's going to move his sperm to those appendages there in the middle of the abdomen. That's where the actual boy part is, and that way he can free these up to grab the back of the female's head. She can reach around, receive the things she needs to have eggs that are fertilized and lay them in the waters here, taking advantage of an isolated wetland, a Carolina Bay, where we don't have to worry so much about fish. Certainly there's other predators, but hey, dragonfly larvae are some of the biggest ones here, and so it's a good place to raise a family if you're a Carolina saddlebags. Love this species. Now, one of the ways we always let dragonflies go when we capture them as naturalists is we do what one of my heroes likes to do, which is to put them upon your nose. This comes with some risk, but it's exciting and fun. So here's my attempt at that with a very erratic and flighty Carolina saddlebags. What do you know? Today's my lucky day. It's one of the more famous plants that you see in the literature when you read about Carolina bays is this shrub. It's known as pond spice. It's actually related to species such as red bay. I've even seen Palamedes swallowtails lay their eggs upon this plant because it can serve as a suitable host plant for the caterpillars. But it does well encumbered by water for very long periods of time, similar to the habits of the pond cypress. Stems here are zigzag, and that's one of the ways I kind of remember this species. Just a simple little standard leaf, maybe an inch long, but those stems zigzagging back and forth, gonna have a tiny little sort of inconspicuous flower. But when you come out here in late summer and fall, beautiful red berries on the pond spice. Another one of my favorite species that's on the edge of the Carolina bays, this is tie-tie, otherwise known as swamp sorilla. And those long little things that you see there are actually the future blooms of this tree. It's going to be bursting in a creamy white here soon, and those blooms will be cloaked with all kinds of pollinators, bees and wasps and butterflies, all coming to get a little bit of sugar to support their daily activities. This plant I'm finally starting to see in the nursery trade. It's a great one for the backyard, mostly evergreen, so it makes a great backdrop. And of course those flowers bringing in all kinds of fantastic insects. Taking a look here at another Carolina Bay species, especially along the margins, mostly evergreen again. This species is known as Zenobia or honeycup. I love the name, honeycup. This has a little honeycup looking bloom here in June, and I love the soft, delicate leaves. They kind of float in the breeze, and they have noticeably dull teeth upon the margins. And then also if you flip them over, bam, contrast, striking white color that makes them easily recognizable. This is in the blueberry family, has a growth habit not altogether different from that. Kind of drapes over, low shrub. Flowers look very similar, as do the fruit. Zenobia, honeycup. Well, you gotta love carnivorous plants, and here's one laid out upon my net. Bladderwort. See the little bladders there, the little swollen pouches? Those are actually filled with air, with gas, and they have little triggers on the outsides, little microorganisms such as the ones we've been seeing, and those that are smaller especially, will trigger those hairs to thus open up the bladder and inflows the water along with the tiny little microorganism to be consumed by this plant known as bladderwort. These come up and have pretty little yellow and purple blooms depending on the species. They float around. They're aquatic plants, and this one's doing quite well and probably finding plenty to eat here in this Carolina Bay. exactly are Carolina bays? Well, we've seen they are wetlands. They are full of water, at least for parts of the year. They have plants that are indicative of wetland situations. And if we were to dig up the soil beneath here, we would see that it also has the signature of being inundated with water for many parts or many months of the year. But these are not wetlands like the bays that we see attached to the ocean, like the ones upon the coast with which we are familiar. These are inland from those areas. Why are they called Carolina bays? This is still a bit of a mystery. Maybe it's because they are surrounded with trees that are named bay trees. We have loblolly bay sometimes, red bay, and sweet bay that surround themselves on the margins of these Carolina bays. Locally, it was recognized that Carolina bays had a number of different qualities in common with one another. They are shallow depressions in an otherwise upland area. They usually hold water for at least parts of the year. They are usually in unconsolidated sediments. That means loose sands that could be easily worked, as opposed to the clay of the Piedmont and the terrain of the mountains. These are usually found in the sandhills or the coastal plain areas. They all tend to be elliptical in shape, with a long axis of their existence running from the northwest down to the southeast. Carolina bays are in a number of different sizes. Some can just be a few hundred feet across, others are a mile or two across. Many of the Carolina bays tend to have a rim of sand upon their northeastern side or upon their southeastern side, and many times both. More recently, it was realized that the rims upon the edges of Carolina bays actually exist at different ages. And so the rim of one Carolina bay might be 10 or 20 or 30,000 years different in age from the rim of another Carolina bay. So hypotheses for the existence and the formation of these bays have run the gamut of there being fish that are swimming around in here when the oceans were upon these lands, and they've flapped their fins and they've made these depressions that we're left with, all the way to things like dinosaur footprints treading upon the land and making these nice circular elliptical depressions that you see in the storybooks of all the dinosaurs. But anyway, 3 or 4 of them really have made their way into the scientific discussion, and probably one of the more famous is that of a meteorite origin. So a body of mass coming from outer space and impacting the Earth. Counter-arguments to that include that a lot of times when that happens, it does not create a shape upon the Earth, a depression upon the Earth, that is the same as what we find in the Carolina bays. It also doesn't always leave a rim of sand on just a couple of edges of the depression. And you can often find evidence of the impact. When you look at the soils, you can see that they've been impacted from something from outer space, and at least a strong collision. Other counter-arguments, and perhaps one of the strongest, is that all these meteorites would have had to decide to just land in the sandhills in the coastal plain. That would be a difficult dilemma. No one land in the Piedmont, no one land in the mountains. Everybody decided to land in the sandhills in the coastal plain. And now that we've got evidence that these perhaps formed at different dates, well, all these meteorites would have had to fallen at different times. So this makes this a hypothesis that has largely been rejected by much of the scientific community. Other hypotheses are that perhaps when the ocean was up upon this soil, it caused the depressions to form. The ocean is a tremendously powerful erosive force, as you know if you've been swimming inside it. But we can't find evidence of other places where these types of shapes are being formed by the power of ocean. Sinkholes is another hypothesis that gets mentioned a lot of times when I'm teaching my class. And indeed, sinkholes exist upon our landscape, and they do sometimes hold water, but usually we can find evidence of limestone soils within these sinkholes, and they often aren't in the same shapes as our Carolina bays, this elliptical shape, and they don't have the deposits of sand that are on the northeastern and southeastern sides of their perimeter. So finally we get to the hypothesis that's been supported by most of the scientific community. When scientists went looking for places where these types of wetlands might exist, they found them in different places across the globe. And they found some of the same qualities that we have in our Carolina bays in those other wetlands across the globe. And in places where these types of wetlands are still forming, it's apparent that winds are especially powerful and determinant in the formation of these wetlands. When wind blows across the landscape and there happens to be a body of water upon that landscape, the energy from the wind moves into the water and creates waves. Waves happen to be a very erosive force. You've witnessed this at the beach before, I'm sure, as you've moved down into the water, and when you come out, you're at a place way down the beach from where you started. To a lesser degree, this can happen on small bodies of water too. And so when scientists looked at this, they noticed that the winds are absorbed by the water, and they scour the edges of the wetland in a way that moves sediment from the edges and deposits it at another end. This would explain the formation of the piled up sand on two sides of Carolina bays. Meanwhile, wind histories that have been developed by scientists by looking at the shapes of sand dunes by the deposition of sediments throughout the last hundreds of thousands of years suggest that winds did move from the northwest down to the southeast, and then to a lesser degree from the southwest up to the northeast. If there were depressions upon this landscape that captured water, and this landscape was open and available to wind, as pollen records suggest that it was, then wind could have moved across this landscape unencumbered, energy could have been absorbed by the water could have moved in a way that would scour the edges and create an elliptical shape that we now know as a Carolina Bay. Many of the dates for Carolina Bay suggest that these formations occurred during the Pleistocene, during the ice ages, when this was a much more open habitat. And you can imagine how the wind feels when you're standing out in a field versus how it feels when you're in the woods. There's less friction in a field, in an open landscape, for the wind to slow down. And so the velocities could be increased and maintained in an open landscape versus the closed one that we now have. So the formation of our Carolina bays has largely ceased because the winds are not moving across the landscape at the degree that they once were. The wind and water hypothesis is also conducive with the different varying ages of the sand dunes sand piles that are found on the margins of the Carolina bays. The formation of these things was episodic. It formed at different times. Indeed, some of the rims, sand rims within a single Carolina bay can be different ages. And so it wasn't a meteorite, because that meteorite would have had to hit the same place 3 different times if there's 3 different rims that formed from the wave action scouring the sediment and piling it up upon the edges. Why were there depressions that held a little bit of water in the first place? It didn't matter what the shape was in the beginning. Why did they exist? Well, this is not such as an important question. If you take a ride on any road after rain, there's always places that hold water. If they happen to hold water for a long period of time, then wind and waves can work on them. They don't have to hold water year-round either. But as long as they do it for enough time to where wind and water can move across them, then they'll slowly start to become shaped in this direction if indeed they get winds from the northwest or the southwest. One of the interesting hypotheses is that it had a lot to do with the melting of permafrost. Remember, these bays formed during the Ice Age, and during the freezing and thawing and the intermission, the changing of periods during the Ice Age, the back and forth of the glaciers and their eventual retreat. This could have melted the permafrost and caused depressions upon the landscape, just as it's doing now in the north because of climate change. Anyway, for whatever reason, there were small incongruities upon the landscape that held water, and over time, with enough wind, another dragonfly there, and enough water, these can be shaped into Carolina bays. How many are there? Well, this is still a largely unanswered question. Early counts that we had several thousand in South Carolina, but more recent studies suggest that we may have as many as 17,000 in our own state, and if you go from Florida up to Virginia, you can count 50 or 60,000 of these Carolina bays. They're very unique. They're very special and very important for all of our wildlife species. When you get a place like this that is unique as that is, then the species that live here are often unique too. They're rare, they're threatened, they're endangered, and we need to do our best to try to protect these places as best we can. We're thankful for places like Savage Bay Heritage Preserve or Woods Bay State Park, for example, that have made sure that these will be a place where wildlife can live and thrive and where you can come and visit too.